Hey there. Welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this new story, the Mitchell family had driven through the Appalachian Mountains more times than they could remember. Weekend road trips had slowly become a tradition that carried them across forgotten highways, quiet valleys, and mountain towns where old brick buildings still stood exactly as they had decades earlier. Every autumn, they returned to the region to watch the forest change from deep green into endless shades of orange, crimson, and gold. Friends often asked why they continued choosing the same destination every year when countless national parks waited across the country. Their answer never changed. Appalachia felt different from everywhere else. The mountains seemed older than memory itself, and every winding road appeared to disappear into another story waiting to be discovered. Their latest journey began during the final week of October after weather forecasts promised clear skies throughout the eastern mountains. David Mitchell loaded camping equipment into the back of his aging SUV, while his wife Laura organized maps collected over nearly 15 years of traveling. Their daughter Emily planned to photograph abandoned churches and forgotten cemeteries scattered throughout remote mountain communities for a college photography project. None of them expected anything beyond another peaceful drive through familiar scenery. They had traveled enough backroads to understand the usual risks. Narrow shoulders, sudden wildlife crossings, and thick evening fog came with nearly every Appalachian trip. Those conditions demanded patience rather than fear. The first day unfolded exactly as expected. Quiet highways crossed broad valleys before climbing steadily into higher elevations where sunlight filtered through towering hardwood forests. Small towns appeared every 30 or 40 miles, each one anchored by old gas stations, family-owned diners, and churches standing beside weathered cemeteries overlooking the hills. Many communities looked untouched by modern development. Rusted railroad tracks disappeared behind abandoned depots, while faded advertisements remained painted across century-old brick buildings. Emily stopped repeatedly to photograph places that seemed frozen somewhere between history and the present day. Every conversation with local residents ended politely, although several older people casually asked whether they planned to remain on the main highways after sunset. Nobody offered direct warnings. Instead, the questions arrived naturally, almost as though they expected visitors to make the safer decision without needing further explanation. David assumed the concern centered around wildlife because black bears and deer frequently wandered across mountain roads after dark. Laura suggested the roads probably became difficult for tourists unfamiliar with endless curves. Neither explanation felt unusual. Remote highways demanded constant attention even during daylight. The family appreciated the concern, but continued following the route they had carefully planned weeks earlier. Late the following afternoon, they entered one of the least populated sections of central Appalachia. Cellular service disappeared almost immediately after leaving the nearest town. Their paper map showed only one highway crossing nearly 70 miles of forest before reaching another community. It looked like the perfect scenic drive. Long stretches followed narrow creeks flowing beside steep hillsides where abandoned farmhouses occasionally appeared behind collapsing fences. Most buildings had clearly been empty for years. Nature slowly reclaimed every porch, driveway, and pasture. The deeper they traveled into the mountains, the fewer signs of modern life remained. They stopped shortly before sunset at a small diner that overlooked a narrow river cutting through the valley. Only a handful of customers remained inside. Most appeared to know one another by name. Conversations paused briefly when the Mitchell family entered before quietly returning to normal. Their waitress welcomed them warmly and recommended homemade soup while asking where they planned to spend the night. David explained they hoped to reach another town roughly 2 hours farther east. The waitress glanced toward an older man drinking coffee near the front window. He He slowly shook his head before returning to his newspaper. After several moments, the waitress leaned closer and suggested taking the interstate instead of the mountain highway they had planned. She explained that the alternate route took longer but remained easier after dark because weather changed quickly in the higher elevations. David smiled politely and thanked her for the advice. Weather forecasts showed clear conditions throughout the evening. Before leaving, the older man quietly spoke only one sentence while passing their table. He said people unfamiliar with those mountains sometimes trusted their maps more than their surroundings. Without another word, he walked outside and disappeared into the parking lot. The family laughed about the encounter after returning to the SUV. Small-town conversations often carried an air of mystery that outsiders easily misunderstood. Laura joked, the warning sounded like something copied from an old ghost story. Emily photographed the fading sunlight spilling across the mountains before they continued east. The highway narrowed into 2 lanes bordered by dense forests that blocked nearly every remaining trace of daylight. Within 20 minutes, the last house disappeared behind them. Darkness settled surprisingly fast beneath the heavy canopy stretching across the road. For the next hour, almost nothing happened. The road twisted through endless ridges, while occasional warning signs announced sharp curves ahead. No other vehicles appeared in either direction. David eventually realized they had not passed a single gas station, driveway, or mailbox since leaving the diner. Even wildlife seemed strangely absent. Usually deer reflected brightly inside approaching headlights, yet the roadside remained completely empty. Laura quietly mentioned how unusually silent the forest looked. The trees stood perfectly still despite forecasts predicting light evening winds. Only the sound of tires rolling across old pavement filled the vehicle. Emily eventually noticed something that none of them immediately understood. Every few miles, the highway crossed small bridges spanning narrow streams flowing through the valleys. Beside each bridge stood identical, weathered wooden signs with faded white lettering almost completely worn away. The first sign appeared too damaged to read. The second looked exactly the same. By the 4th bridge, Emily became certain every sign carried identical cracks, identical missing corners, and identical rust stains around each bolt. She scrolled through her camera and compared photographs taken minutes apart. The signs appeared indistinguishable from one another. David suggested the county probably replaced damaged signs using identical materials years earlier. His explanation sounded reasonable until Laura pointed toward the next bridge. The same sign stood beside the road once again. Emily photographed it while slowing the image on her camera screen. One deep scratch curved across the lower right corner exactly like the previous 4 signs. The family joked about entering the Appalachian version of the movie Groundhog Day. None of them considered the possibility seriously because mountain roads often contained repetitive landmarks that blurred together after dark. Still, Emily quietly continued documenting every bridge they crossed. Nearly 40 minutes later, the fuel gauge attracted David's attention. He remembered checking it shortly after leaving the diner. The tank had been nearly full. Now, the needle rested only slightly above half. He mentally calculated the distance traveled and frowned. The vehicle should not have consumed that much fuel under ordinary highway driving. Laura suggested the constant climbing through steep mountains probably explained the difference. David accepted the explanation, even though something still felt wrong. According to the odometer, they had traveled almost 70 miles, yet the map suggested another 60 remained before reaching the next town. Somehow, the drive already felt much longer than expected. Emily suddenly looked away from her camera toward the passenger window. Far ahead between the trees, she thought she noticed a small white building standing alone above the highway. As the SUV rounded another curve, the structure disappeared behind dense forest before returning into view several minutes later. It looked exactly the same distance away as before. David assumed another curve created the illusion, yet 15 minutes passed before they finally reached the building. It turned out to be an abandoned church surrounded by a tiny cemetery enclosed behind an iron fence leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Every headstone faced the road as though watching traffic pass through the valley. Laura suggested stopping briefly so Emily could take photographs while they stretched their legs. David hesitated because complete darkness now surrounded the mountains. The nearest lights remained far beyond the next ridge. Eventually, curiosity outweighed caution. He parked beside the empty churchyard while the engine continued idling. The air outside felt noticeably colder than expected. No insects chirped, no distant dogs barked. Even the nearby creek seemed strangely quiet, despite flowing only a short distance below the road. Emily lifted her camera toward the old church as a faint sound echoed somewhere inside the surrounding forest. It resembled footsteps moving across dry leaves, slow, evenly spaced, too heavy for small animals, yet too deliberate for deer running through undergrowth. David immediately scanned the tree line using his flashlight. Nothing reflected back. The beam reached rows of bare trunks before disappearing into darkness. Laura quietly called Emily back toward the SUV. The footsteps stopped almost immediately after everyone returned inside. David locked the doors without discussing what any of them had heard. Minutes later, the church disappeared behind another bend, leaving only darkness stretching endlessly ahead through the Appalachian Mountains. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clench Mountain Range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archived notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archived notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable, heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed. Archived notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth, melted door frames remains. University, biology, science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill, while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then, absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed these sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archived notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archived notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this news story, Washington's small-town horror stories that locals never talk about. Sultan, Washington remains a quiet region where the dense evergreens often hide the heavy morning mist in the early fall. Local residents usually avoid discussing the specific events that occurred near the edge of the Skycomish River during 2015. Records from the county sheriff indicate that several calls regarding unexplained activity originated from a single remote property that year. Investigators reportedly found the circumstances surrounding the inhabitants to be highly irregular based on the available dispatch logs from then. The following account details the documented experiences of 3 individuals who encountered something they simply could not easily explain. 32-year-old Mark Miller worked as a local timber surveyor who spent most of his days deep within the woods. He lived in a modest cabin with his younger brother David, who was 24 and worked as a seasonal mechanic. Their friend Sarah joined them during the autumn months to help renovate the aging structure before the harsh winter arrived. The group intended to finish the exterior repairs quickly so they could enjoy the isolation of the Washington wilderness. State records show that Mark had lived in the area for nearly a decade without reporting any significant safety issues. They did not realize that their presence on the property had been noted by someone or something in the brush. The dense forest surrounding the property was comprised of ancient cedar trees that effectively blocked out most of the natural sunlight. Archived notes from a previous land survey conducted in 2010 mention that the soil in this region was unusually soft. Mark discovered several sets of deep indentations in the earth that did not match any known wildlife species in the area. Some locals claimed that the property had a history of trespassing issues involving people who lived off the grid nearby. Investigators never confirmed the identity of these individuals because the dense terrain made tracking nearly impossible for the local authorities. The 3 friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched from the dark shadows of the towering trees. Dispatch logs from late September 2015 indicate that Mark called the sheriff to report a series of loud metallic bangs. He stated that the noises seemed to originate from the corrugated metal roof of the tool shed behind the main cabin. David reportedly inspected the area with a high-powered spotlight, but he saw no one standing in the immediate vicinity. A county file from 2009 describes similar reports of vandalism that were never solved by the responding patrol officers. Sarah noted in her personal journal that the atmosphere on the property had changed from peaceful to something quite oppressive. They decided to install several motion-activated lights around the perimeter to ensure their safety during the long and dark nights. State records from October 2015 showed that the local power grid experienced several unexplained surges, specifically in the Sultan area. Sarah reportedly found that all of the heavy kitchen appliances had been moved several inches away from the wooden walls. She told the investigators that she heard the sound of slow breathing coming from the other side of her door. Records conflict regarding whether there were any signs of forced entry found by the officers who arrived later that evening. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built on top of an old mining shaft that created strange acoustic effects. The group became increasingly paranoid as they realized that their physical environment was being subtly altered by an unknown force. Archive notes from the county coroner mention a discovery of several dead animals that were arranged in a perfect circle. Mark found these remains near the edge of the clearing where he usually parked his heavy-duty timber hauling truck. Investigators never confirmed if the animals had been killed by a predator or if they were placed there by someone. The county file from 2009 mentions that a previous resident had reported finding similar patterns in the high grass. David reportedly began to suffer from severe sleep deprivation because he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch every night. He described the noise as a heavy dragging sound that lasted for several minutes before fading away into the deep woods. Dispatch logs from November 2015 record a second call regarding a security breach in the lower level of the cabin. David reportedly found the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door had been snapped off with a pair of bolt cutters. He told the deputy that nothing appeared to be missing from the storage area despite the door being left wide open. State records indicate that the officers found no fingerprints on the metal surface of the lock or the door handle itself. Some locals claimed that a group of transients was known to use the abandoned mining tunnels for shelter during the winter. Investigators never confirmed this theory because no one was ever located in the subterranean passages beneath the Sultan Forest area. Sarah reportedly captured a single grainy photograph of a figure standing near the tree line during the early hours of the morning. The image shows a tall and thin shape that appears to be wearing a dark hooded coat with no visible face. Archived notes from the sheriff department state that the photograph was too blurry to provide any useful evidence for a search. Records conflict on whether the figure was a physical person or simply a trick of the light among the tall trees. Mark decided to board up the lower windows of the cabin to prevent anyone from looking inside during the night. The three friends stopped leaving the house after the sun went down because the feeling of being hunted became too intense. The final entry in the county file from 2015 describes a massive disturbance that occurred on the 3rd of December. Dispatch logs indicate that a neighbor heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by several loud screams coming from the property. When the officers arrived, they found the front door standing open, and the interior of the cabin was in total disarray. State records show that a significant amount of blood was found on the kitchen floor, but no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the biological samples because the DNA profiles did not match any of the residents. Some locals claimed that they saw 3 people walking into the river, but these reports were never verified by the police. A massive search party was organized by the local community members who spent 3 weeks combing through the dense evergreen forest. Volunteers reportedly found a single piece of torn clothing that belonged to Sarah snagged on a thick branch near the river. State records indicate that the search was eventually called off due to the arrival of a severe winter storm that year. The investigators found several items of personal value scattered along a trail that led toward the highest peak in the region. Records conflict regarding whether the items were dropped in a hurry or if they were placed as markers for the police. No trace of Mark or David or Sarah was ever found despite the extensive efforts of the local search and rescue teams. The case remains unsolved in the archive notes of the Washington State Police as a mysterious disappearance with no clear motive. The property in Sultan was eventually sold to a private developer who demolished the cabin and cleared the surrounding forest area. County records from 2021 show that no further incidents have been reported on that specific piece of land since. People who live in the region still avoid the area near the Skycomish River when the heavy morning mist rolls in. They reportedly believe that some secrets are better left buried in the soft soil of the deep and dark Washington woods. The true fate of the 3 residents remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the small town. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered entirely, completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunt state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly, entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute sheer unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing accountant accidentally fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Lisa completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain mostly, completely, thoroughly uncharted and deeply, heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public-state records conflict regarding the actual total highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange, bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure, concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual absolute terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. State records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams completely, entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely, permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient, predatory anomalies. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the 9th night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that 3 separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent 2 troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance. When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archived notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. The unmarked road, hidden deep in Appalachia. Deep in the heavily forested Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a lost driver experienced a completely unexplainable, terrifying event. During the bitter winter of 2020, a dedicated commercial trucker encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What local authorities eventually uncovered completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific, dark, rural mountain community forever. Archived notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 42-year-old Arthur Pendleton worked as a dedicated commercial transport driver, simply trying to finish his route. His isolated route forced him through a highly outdated rural mountainous region located miles away from any major modern interstates. His primary daily objective required him to safely deliver heavy industrial equipment completely alone during the long, dark winter nights. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual missing traveler cases originating from that exact region. Arthur arrived on November 12th and immediately began carefully navigating the icy, narrow roads while listening to the quiet radio. The first quiet, freezing hours passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents, as the exhausted driver cautiously navigated sharp turns. State records confirm that severe, scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Arthur stopped his massive truck shortly after midnight because he clearly saw a massive fallen tree blocking the highway. He initially assumed a severe winter windstorm had aggressively knocked the massive dead pine completely across the designated rural road. When he cautiously looked directly at his digital navigation map, he noticed a highly obscure, unmarked dirt bypass road nearby. Arthur aggressively turned his heavy commercial vehicle onto the unpaved path, hoping to safely bypass the massive solid wooden obstruction. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. The isolated, terrified driver immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed truck cabin. Arthur quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff department during that night. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid dirt foundation and violently rattled the thick truck windows. Arthur scrambled frantically behind the heavy wooden steering wheel and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the trees. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the parked commercial delivery truck. The strange dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal bright ambient light from the moon. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Arthur frantically, urgently insisted he absolutely needed to completely abandon the dangerous dirt road and aggressively reverse his heavy vehicle. He completely strongly pushed the heavy transmission lever, but he soon realized the main electrical engine panel was displaying sparks. He was effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced commercial delivery drivers. The desperate, anxious driver decided to blindly, violently run toward the back, hoping to retrieve his heavy defensive metal tools. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark dirt road until he eventually physically discovered massive, strange, deep tracks. Arthur remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid metal trailer while intensely listening for any sudden, aggressive movements. Archived notes from Arthur stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly near trees. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale shapes vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position down low. He huddled tightly safely against the heavy metal tires while strongly clutching a heavy steel wrench for absolutely necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell totally dead silent as freezing winds stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath the rubber tires. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. Arthur frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive digital battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped near the vehicle. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack the reinforced metal, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Arthur slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel wrench tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling, extremely violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the thick truck windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness outside the truck, the terrified driver blindly, frantically crawled toward the deep brush. He hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, hidden, thorny bush until the early morning sunlight eventually safely arrived. A commercial timber delivery operator miraculously happily found the rural vehicle completely abandoned near the heavily designated gravel access channel. The highly traumatized young driver was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by broken glass. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated for shock. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned truck, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel vehicle doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. Arthur was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional psychological support presence. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep edge of the woods. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing driver accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive, deep, dark entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel doors were completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Arthur completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising commercial transport delivery plans and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, populated city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark road experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply, severely suffered from chronic daily heavy insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated, unmarked mountain road remains mostly, completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by many local residents. Experienced local rural highway patrolmen actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice drivers from widely exploring that specific acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing traveler cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark, unmarked road, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Arthur. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant outside entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown, massive humanoid animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply, safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying, unmarked road case. Arthur constantly refuses to leave his secure concrete urban apartment whenever the winter season finally slowly descends upon the city. He strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely fastened throughout the entire duration of the night. The actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within those ancient, desolate Appalachian Mountains might never be completely, fully understood logically. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered forever. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The Hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the Hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the Hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. The whispering ridges of Blackwood Canyon. The eastern slopes of the mountain range remained largely unmapped during the late 19th century, attracting only the most resilient timber cruisers and surveyors. In the autumn of roughly 80 years ago, a team of 4 experienced land surveyors established a base camp in a deep, heavily forested valley known locally as Blackwood Canyon. Their objective was to plot the boundaries of a proposed timber reserve, a task requiring them to spend several weeks in total isolation from the nearest settlement. The environment was characterized by dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir, steep rocky terrain, and a silence so profound that the men initially remarked on the complete absence of typical forest sounds. By the 4th day of the expedition, the routine nature of their work began to shift, as a series of unexplained auditory sensations disrupted the camp. The men reported hearing what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls of the canyon rather than from any distinct physical source. The lead surveyor, a veteran of wilderness campaigns named Thomas Albright, noted in his logs that the sounds did not align with any known wildlife or geological activity. The noises typically began just after sundown, starting as a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground before transitioning into distinct, modulated cadences resembling human speech. When the crew attempted to trace the sound, they found that its apparent direction shifted constantly, making it impossible to pinpoint an origin point. The younger members of the crew, including a transit operator named Edward Lynn, expressed growing discomfort, describing a sensation of intense pressure in their ears whenever the chanting commenced. Despite their unease, the team maintained their daily schedule, attributing the phenomenon to unusual wind currents passing through the narrow rock formations higher up the ridge. However, the lack of any significant wind during those chilly, still autumn nights quickly complicated that rationalization. As the first week drew to a close, the auditory disturbances escalated from distant hums to loud, distinct vocalizations that appeared to occur much closer to the perimeter of their camp. On the night of October 12th, all four men awoke simultaneously to the sound of a single, sustained note that seemed to vibrate the very canvas of their tents. Albright exited his tent with a lantern, but found nothing in the surrounding woods except for a peculiar, localized mist that hung low to the ground despite a clear sky overhead. The camp dog, a large retriever known for its reliable tracking instincts, refused to leave the shelter of the supply wagon and spent the remaining hours of the night whimpering. The next morning, the crew discovered that their brass surveying instruments, which had been securely locked in wooden cases, were completely out of alignment, their delicate internal needles pointing wildly away from magnetic north. The psychological toll of the continuous, unexplained noise began to manifest in the behavior of the crew members, who reported experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of vast subterranean spaces. Lynn, in particular, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the sounds were a form of communication, spending his evening hours sitting at the edge of the firelight, listening intently to the darkness. His journals from that week contained frantic attempts to transcribe the phonetic patterns of the chanting, resulting in pages of repetitive, nonsensical symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. The other men attempted to dissuade him from his isolation, but a growing sense of irritability and mutual suspicion began to fracture the group dynamic. The shared perception of an unseen, listening presence in the valley created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that made sleep nearly impossible. By mid-October, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing heavy frost but no wind to explain the persistent acoustic phenomena. The team decided to accelerate their fieldwork in order to leave the canyon ahead of schedule, working longer hours in the rugged upper terrain. During these daytime excursions, the men began to experience sensory distortions, reporting that the forest appeared strangely flat and devoid of color, as if a thick veil had been drawn over the landscape. They also noted that their perception of time seemed heavily altered, with hours passing in what felt like mere moments, or conversely, a single afternoon stretching out into an agonizingly long ordeal. On several occasions, members of the party became momentarily separated in wide-open clearings, only to find themselves completely disoriented and unable to locate their companions who were standing less than 50 yards away. The peak incident occurred on the night of October 20th, during a period of total atmospheric stillness. The chanting, which had been absent during the day, returned with an unprecedented intensity that made conversation within the camp impossible without shouting. According to later accounts collected from the survivors, the sound did not seem to travel through the air, but rather originated from within their own skulls, creating an intense throbbing sensation behind their eyes. At approximately midnight, Lynn abruptly stood up from his bed, walked past his companions without speaking, and strode directly into the unlit forest toward the steepest section of the canyon wall. Albright and the remaining crew grabbed lanterns and pursued him immediately, but the dense undergrowth and the overwhelming nature of the sound severely hindered their progress through the dark. They followed the sound of Lynn crashing through the brush until they reached the base of a massive, sheer cliff face where the acoustic vibrations were so intense that the lantern glass began to shatter. Through the dim, flickering light of the remaining lanterns, the men observed Lynn standing motionless against the rock, his head tilted back as if looking toward the summit. When Albright approached to pull him away, Lynn turned around, exhibiting a state of profound shock, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He insisted that the wall of rock was no longer solid, but rather a vast opening leading into a brightly lit space filled with moving figures. The other crew members saw only the solid gray expanse of limestone, but the discrepancy in their perceptions caused an immediate, panicked retreat back to the main camp. The following morning, the team abandoned the majority of their heavy equipment and began a rapid descent out of Blackwood Canyon, determined to reach the nearest logging outpost. Lynn remained in a catatonic state during the entire trek, requiring physical assistance to walk and showing no awareness of his surroundings. The remaining 3 men were plagued by a persistent ringing in their ears and a deep physical exhaustion that did not subside even after they exited the valley. Upon reaching safety, the surveyors underwent medical evaluations where doctors noted that all 4 men exhibited symptoms typically associated with extreme prolonged exposure to low-frequency vibrations, including inner ear damage and severe cognitive disorientation. An official investigation into the incident was launched by the Regional Surveying Office, primarily to recover the expensive abandoned equipment and to verify the claims made by the crew. A secondary team of surveyors, accompanied by 2 local law enforcement officers, entered Blackwood Canyon 3 weeks after the original party had fled. They located the base camp intact, though they noted that the surrounding vegetation showed unusual signs of localized desiccation, with leaves and pine needles scorched as if subjected to intense heat, despite no evidence of an actual fire. The brass instruments were recovered from their boxes, but examiners later determined that their metal components had become permanently demagnetized, rendering them completely useless for future geographic work. The second expedition experienced none of the acoustic phenomena reported by Albright's crew, finding the valley to be entirely quiet and unremarkable. They concluded that the original team had likely suffered from a form of collective hysteria brought on by the extreme isolation, poor rations, and the deceptive echoes common to narrow, rocky canyons. This environmental explanation, however, failed to satisfy the men who had lived through the experience, particularly given the permanent physical changes they suffered. Lynn never fully recovered his faculties and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium, where he continued to insist until his death that a part of his mind had remained behind inside the stone walls of the ridge. The case of Blackwood Canyon was eventually archived in regional historical records as a curious footnote in the mapping of the territory, largely forgotten by the public. Modern researchers who have examined the surviving logs and medical reports suggest that the valley may possess unique geological features capable of producing infrasound, which can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and physiological distress in humans. Others point to the possibility of localized pocket emissions of natural gases that could distort perception and cause collective neurological symptoms. To this day, the exact nature of what the surveyors encountered in that isolated valley remains unresolved, leaving behind only the eerie, unsettling testimonies of the men who heard the ridge's whisper. The lingering questions surrounding the event continued to discourage further development in Blackwood Canyon for decades after the survey team's disastrous expedition. Local logging companies found that workers were highly reluctant to enter the valley, citing the old stories of the chanting and the psychological breakdown of the surveyors. Even when high-quality timber became scarce in adjacent areas, the canyon remained untouched, preserved by a reputation that time did not seem to dim. The few independent trappers who ventured near the perimeter of the valley in the early 20th century reported that the local wildlife appeared to avoid the deep interior of the canyon, preferring the more open, less oppressive terrain of the outer slopes. In the late 1950s, a university geology department attempted to conduct a comprehensive acoustic survey of the region to either confirm or disprove the infrasound hypothesis permanently. The researchers set up highly sensitive recording devices at various elevations along the canyon walls, hoping to capture any low-frequency vibrations generated by the unique rock formations. During their 2-week stay, the instruments recorded several instances of unusual seismic microtremors, but no significant acoustic anomalies were detected that matched the descriptions in Albright's journals. The study concluded that while the canyon's shape could theoretically amplify certain sounds, there was no contemporary evidence of any ongoing, unexplained phenomena active in the area. Despite the scientific community's skepticism, the private papers of Thomas Albright, which were donated to a regional historical society by his descendants, offer a much more personal and unsettling view of the aftermath. In his later years, Albright became a recluse, refusing to travel anywhere near mountainous terrain and keeping his home illuminated at all times of the night. His personal diaries reveal that he remained convinced until his final days that the phenomenon they encountered was not a product of the wind or gas, but something inherent to the location itself. He wrote extensively about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life when the memory of that absolute vibrating silence continued to echo in his mind, undermining his confidence in the physical world. The story of the Blackwood Canyon incident survives today primarily within the specialized archives of regional folklore and historical geography societies, away from mainstream media attention. It serves as a stark reminder of the limits of early exploration and the profound psychological effects that the deep wilderness can inflict on those who attempt to measure it. The unresolved discrepancy between the physical evidence of damaged equipment and the subjective horror experienced by the surveyors ensures that the valley retains its enigmatic status. Whether the events were caused by an undiscovered natural mechanism or a temporary distortion of human perception, the canyon remains a place where the boundary between reality and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin for 4 forgotten men. In this new story, quiet California urban legends that people still whisper about at night. In 2022, state records from a coastal county in California detailed a series of strange occurrences involving hikers. Local authorities reportedly investigated multiple claims of unidentified figures moving through the dense fog during the early morning hours near Big Sur. These archived notes suggest that several individuals vanished without a trace while walking along the well-marked trails of the region. Investigators never confirmed any foul play, yet some locals claim that certain sections of the forest should remain completely avoided. The official dispatch logs indicate that search parties found only abandoned equipment left behind by the missing people during late autumn. Mark was a 34-year-old park ranger who worked specifically within the rugged terrain of the Central Coast. His daily job required him to monitor wildlife patterns and maintain the safety of the various trails used by seasonal tourists. He arrived at the remote observation station with the goal of documenting local coyote populations for a state-funded study. Records conflict regarding his exact location during the final hours of his shift before he failed to check in officially. The county file from 2009 mentions that no distress signal was ever received from his standard-issue radio equipment. Mark reportedly left his official vehicle parked at the trailhead with the engine still running and the driver door open. The search team discovered a set of footprints that appeared to lead directly into a solid wall of thick brush. Archived notes from the investigation describe how the tracks stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. State records indicate that the soil around the tracks showed no signs of a struggle or any other human presence. Investigators never confirmed if the footprints belonged to Mark or if another person had been walking in that specific area. The county file from 2009 remains one of the most puzzling cases for the local sheriff department to solve. Some locals claimed that they heard a metallic tapping sound coming from the canyon for several nights after he disappeared. Sarah was a 28-year-old freelance photographer who traveled to the area to capture the unique natural light. She spent most of her time near the cliff edges where the Pacific Ocean meets the rocky shoreline of Northern California. Her purpose for being in the location was to complete a series of images for a prestigious travel magazine project. Sarah reportedly told her friends that she felt a strange sensation of being watched while she was taking her photographs. State records show that her last social media post was a photo of the ocean taken at 4 in the afternoon. The image appears to show a dark shape standing just behind a cluster of trees on the edge of the cliff. Dispatch logs reveal that several residents called the police to report a woman screaming near the beach that same evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the screams, and they found no evidence of any person being in distress there. Archived notes describe how her car was found, with the keys still in the ignition and her wallet on the seat. Some locals claimed that the coastal fog can play tricks on the ears and make the wind sound like human voices. State records from 2023 indicate that a commercial diver found a small piece of blue fabric near the rocks. This fabric reportedly matched the color of the jacket Sarah was wearing on the day that she was last seen alive. The small-town residents often speak about a third individual named David, who was a 40-year-old local historian. David spent many years collecting old maps of the Sierra Nevada mountains to find the location of the lost village. The county file from 2009 includes a map that he had hand-drawn with several red circles on it. State records show that he purchased a large amount of survival gear just 2 days before he left for his trip. Some locals claimed that David believed the lost village was protected by people who did not want to be found. Investigators never confirmed if he reached his destination, but they found his empty tent near a remote mountain stream. Archived notes mention that the tent was torn from the inside, as if something was trying to get out quickly. A local rancher reportedly told the sheriff that he saw a group of men dressed in dark clothing near the stream. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that the rancher was considered a reliable witness by the local authorities at the time. State records show that the men were never identified and they seem to have no connection to the nearby towns. Records conflict regarding whether the men were carrying tools or if they were simply walking through the dense forest area. Investigators never confirmed if these men were related to the disappearance of David or the other missing hikers in California. The county file from 2009 mentions that several other historians had disappeared in the same region over decades. Some locals claimed that there are secret tunnels under the mountains that date back to the time of the gold rush. State records indicate that no such tunnels have ever been officially discovered by geologists or by any modern survey teams. Archived notes from 2012 describe a series of low-frequency vibrations that were recorded by seismic sensors in the area. Investigators never confirmed the cause of these vibrations, but they noted that the local wildlife became very agitated and loud. Records conflict on whether these events are linked to the urban legends that continue to haunt the rural coastal towns. Another report in the dispatch logs from 2019 describes a driver who claimed to see a transparent figure on Highway 1. The driver was a 50-year-old long-haul trucker who had been working the California routes for 20 years. He reportedly saw a person standing in the middle of the road during a heavy rainstorm near the Big Sur Bridge. State records show that he slammed on his brakes, but there was no impact and no body was ever found. Investigators never confirmed if the trucker was suffering from fatigue or if he truly saw something on the lonely road. Archived notes from the Highway Patrol mention that 3 other drivers reported the same figure during that specific weekend. Some locals claimed that the figure is a woman who vanished from a nearby resort during the summer of 1990. Records conflict regarding her name, but the county file from 2009 contains a missing person report from that era. State records indicate that she was a 42-year-old tourist from Oregon who was visiting the coast alone. Dispatch logs from 1990 show that her hotel room was left exactly as if she intended to return shortly. Investigators never confirmed any leads in her case, and the file was eventually moved to the Cold Case Department for review. The archive notes mention that her footprints were found leading away from the resort and into the deep ocean water. In 2021, a group of researchers found a set of old keys buried in the sand near the cliffs. The county file from 2009 lists these keys as a possible match for a car owned by David. State records show that the keys were heavily corroded, but they still functioned when they were tested on a similar lock. Some locals claimed that finding the keys was a sign that the missing people are still present in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory, and the keys were placed into an evidence locker for further study by forensic teams. Archived notes from the lab report indicate that there was no usable DNA found on the surface of the metal. Dispatch logs from the winter of 2024 mention a series of strange phone calls to the local police station. The callers reportedly heard nothing but heavy breathing and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the line. State records show that these calls were traced back to a phone booth that had been disconnected for 15 years. Investigators never confirmed how a disconnected phone could make outgoing calls to the emergency dispatch center during the middle of the night. Records conflict on whether this was a technical glitch in the aging phone system or a series of deliberate pranks. Some locals claimed that the calls always happen on the anniversary of the major disappearances in the coastal region. Archive notes from a retired sheriff detail his personal belief that the geography of California hides many secrets from the public. He reportedly spent his retirement years cataloging the various urban legends and mapping them against the official state records of incidents. The county file from 2009 contains a letter he wrote to the governor regarding the high number of cases. State records show that the governor never responded to the letter, and the sheriff passed away in 2021. Investigators never confirmed if his research had any merit or if he was simply an old man with too much time. Some locals claimed that his private journals were taken by men in dark suits after his funeral ended. Records conflict regarding the contents of those journals, but some believe they contained the truth about the missing people of California. Archive notes from a local librarian suggest that the sheriff had found a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. State records show that most of the events occur during the transition between the spring and the summer seasons each year. Dispatch logs from 2025 indicate that 2 more hikers have gone missing near the same coastal trail system. Investigators never confirmed if these new cases are related to the historical legends that have been told for many years. Some locals claimed that the forest is slowly expanding and reclaiming the land that was once occupied by the settlers. The county file from 2009 remains a primary source of information for those who seek to understand these events. State records will continue to document the facts, while the urban legends will continue to grow in the quiet coastal towns. Archived notes from the investigation suggest that the truth may never be fully known by the authorities or the public. Investigators never confirmed any supernatural activity, but the data they collected remains difficult to explain using only modern scientific methods. Records conflict on the final count of people who have vanished into the fog of the Northern California coastline. Some locals claimed that if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the voices of the missing. In this new story, terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after 2 members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than has-hone. Zero hash is greater than Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archive notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archive notes from the forensic examination describe the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archive notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archive notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty.